Hey guys, welcome back to the Uncommodified podcast and to another UNCORK conversation with my good friend and leadership historian, Craig Minchin. Craig, welcome to the show again, my friend.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Tim.
I know. Hey, we're laughing from our pre-show conversation still, so this is going to
Yeah.
be a good one tonight. So this podcast tonight, of course, will be brought to you by Scotch at some point, and we'll tell you what we're going to be drinking. Because whenever I do a podcast with Craig, we got to break out the Scotch, and it's brought to you by there's no sponsors on the Uncommodified, but today's show is brought to you by a great new little website. Well, not little in size and scope, but not in content. But what is that great little website, Craig?
It is historyunfurled.com. Thank you for the plug. That is a site that I launched earlier this year, actually. And so,
Awesome.
yeah, that's kind of one of the big things I've been working on since we last connected.
It's pretty cool. And you know what? I'm going to let our listeners behind the curtain a little bit. Craig, it was a couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago, that you and my lovely wife and your lovely wife, we were out for dinner in Clarkson,
Yep.
near the lakeshore, near Toronto, and we were just chatting about life and what you're passionate about. And what I love about that is that dinner spawned, I think, some exciting things for you and brought you on a journey. You came out of the closet effectively as a historian, didn't you?
Yeah, and I like the made up title that you gave me, leadership historian. Thank you very
Yeah,
much for that. Gives
you're
me a lot of
welcome.
street cred. But
Yeah.
yeah, Tim, you and I talk about that. But yeah, that dinner was really to say provocative is really an understatement. And out of that evening together, some really cool things of substance have come into my life, and yeah, I'm enjoying things, and I look back to that dinner as a really formative time.
Yeah. Yeah. And listen, I'm going to just say if you're listening and if you got something in your heart and you're passionate about, like Craig was, get it unstuck, man. Like get it out of the tube, get it unstuck, launch it into the real world and see what happens. Because that's what Craig's been doing the last couple of years with his passion for studying leaders and leadership and history. And all that's culminated in this new website and a brand new job opportunity that you have that really fits into who you are and all this podcasting stuff. And you know what? The law of attraction works in the universe. When you throw it out there, things start sticking on you. And I'm
Yeah.
excited by the journey. And I love having you on the show. And my listeners love our episodes. I will say that I always see a really significant spike in listenership when we release a podcast together. So we better get into it before people get tired of
Awesome.
my ranting and raving about you. I got a man crush on you, Craig. I can't help it. Can't
I
help
love
it.
it.
Well, and also I should point out for those of you watching by YouTube, well, if you see this on our YouTube channel, you'll notice I'm in my podcast studio and Craig is in his eldest daughter's bedroom because she's gone to university and Craig like stormed the gates and took it back and now that's the new office.
Yeah, so space in our house has been at a premium during COVID. All of us are kind of working from home,
Yeah.
and so yeah, I told our daughter as soon as she moved out and went to school, I was commandeering her room. So yeah, she'll be happy to see this. By the way, she's really happy about this.
That's awesome. And maybe at the end of the podcast, we'll stop the podcast recording and we'll leave the YouTube channel going on a little bit. Maybe you'll lie on the bed for our listeners and they can have a look at that. Come, that's Craig. Come on, you could do like an ancient pose from history. You know how they lounged around a lot apparently.
See, now you're starting to branch into other different kinds of forms of entertainment. So.
That'd be funny. All right. Listen, let's kick this off. Before we
All
have a
right.
whiskey, I want to read a quote to you, Craig, that you sent to me in preparation for this conversation tonight that we're going to have about a historical figure, a gentleman named of Haile Selassie. You may know about him. You may not know him. I don't know much about this guy, so I'm looking forward to this conversation. But let me read this quote to you and to my listeners. This is what Haile said. Haile Selassie: "We must become bigger than we have been, more courageous, greater in spirit, larger in outlook. We must become members of a new race, overcoming petty prejudice, owning our own allegiance not to nations, but to our fellow man within the human community." What a powerful quote. Now, why did you send me that quote? What does this mean to you? And why is it such a great quote from this man?
What a great quote from the guy who's been named the father of Africa, the father of a whole continent. And he led a country which in recent months I've started to kind of fall in love with a little bit as a result of his work there. Ethiopia, it's an ancient country. It's at one point in time by early historians was listed as one of the great powers and influences in the world, along Rome, Greece, Egypt, and then they called it Axum, Ethiopia. And he was trying to connect ancient past with the current and the future reality. So he was trying to pull out the pride of being an ancient Ethiopian and the place in the world and the place in the continent of Africa. So he was trying to establish himself and the country as leaders on a continent. And I just love it. It's such a great quote because he's saying, let's rise above tribalism. Let's rise above race. Let's rise above, and let's come into the new world in the new era. So he's a person who constantly pulled from his past, but was always looking to the future and to inspire people with the future.
Awesome. So listen, as every great conversation between you and I always starts, and our UNCORK conversations on this podcast, we're going to crack open a whiskey, and I think we'll have a drink to Haile Selassie this evening. I think. What are you drinking, Craig, by the way? Because you have drinks that intrigue me at your house when I come over. What are you drinking?
This is a 27-year single malt Scotch. I believe it's an Islay. It's called the Altavone. And so I got introduced to that this year.
Awesome. So that Scotch is a year younger than my son. That's an old Scotch. That's awesome.
An old Scotch, yeah.
And I have a special bottle. I'll show it to my YouTube listeners. I got a special Scotch called Timorius Beastie, and this was given to me as a special bottle by my friends, actually, Chris and Liv McQueen. Chris is the producer on my show, and they gave this to me for my birthday a number of years ago. And actually, there's very little gone from this because I typically only drink it once a year on my birthday. So let's pretend it's my birthday today. It's not really, but I'm going to pretend. And I love the back of this because it says the original Timorius Beastie was immortalized by Robbie Burns' famous Scots poem "To a Mouse." There was a timid little field mouse echoing our national bard's wit. Ours is most certainly not for the faint of heart. Wow. I don't know who writes this stuff on the back of Scotch bottles, but man, it's sappy.
But what a job. What a job that would be.
Yeah, so cheers to you. I'm drinking the Beastie, and you're drinking the 27-year-old. Cheers. Never met a Scotch I didn't love.
Yeah.
Now, Scottish people, that's a different story. Can't get into that today. That's a whole different... Sorry, if you're Scottish.
You've met a lot that you don't...
Yeah, no, fair enough. Anyways, listen, let's get back to the matter at hand. Haile Selassie. We just drank to him. We listened to a quote from him. Tell us a little bit about him, Craig. Who was he? What did he do? Where did he live? When did this all happen? Take us through his life, in a quality 1 minute. No, I mean, come on, 5 minutes. Give us something about this man. Explain who he is.
So he, born in 1892, just to kind of bookend the conversation, 1892, died in 1974. Don't know exactly the date of his death because he was basically assassinated, just to get to the end of the story here. Son of an Ethiopian... Hold
on. That was like, spoiler alert.
Yeah. Sorry, you have to edit that out or put it at the end. He died, by the way. So, son of an Ethiopian war hero, and the villain in this story, if there is one, would be the Italian forces. And so, his father had fought against the Italian. It was outnumbered by the Italian forces, and asserted himself. And the small Ethiopian army, as a result of his father's leadership and the current emperor at the time, won a victory. He was someone who I would say was groomed for leadership. So being the son of a war hero certainly helps. So his father went on from being a war hero to be like an official member of the government. Ethiopia at the time was a feudal system, so it had a very old system. And basically that's a very few people own the land, and then, lack of a better expression, the peasants would work it. And so it was kind of an outdated system. Each territory within Ethiopia had their own king or prince or governor. They were all the same thing. They all felt they were sovereign, and they would give tribute to the crown each year. And so it was a bit of an ancient country, an ancient system. Ethiopia has captured the imagination of Europeans for centuries. It is the second oldest Christian nation on planet, where Christianity is the state religion. The first one is Armenia. It most notably draws its kingly line back to the legendary King Solomon from the Bible. It's full of stone churches. Apparently the lost Ark of the Covenant is there. There's a mythical character He was kind of fake news, but Prester John was supposed to have come from that land, leading a Christian nation. So that was their history. It's a very it's a history that really intrigued Europeans and Westerners overall.
Hold on for a second, Craig. Wait a second. Wait a second. I thought the Ark of the Covenant was on Oak Island when we went there. Oh, whoa! You hold on. Stop. Full stop
It's like
here.
we got duped.
Hold
It's
on.
like we got duped.
I thought when we went to Oak Island on that trip, you and me and Pam and
Yeah.
Marcia, I thought the Ark of the Covenant was on Oak Island, brother.
Yeah, and that's one of the theories, right? You know, but it is apparently in a chapel
Okay.
in Ethiopia, protected. No one can see it. So
Interesting.
it's you can see how it's a land that would kind of capture people's imagination,
Sure.
without knowing, even knowing the full details of the history. So I'd say he was groomed for leadership. So when his father died, he was about 14 years old when his father died, and before his father died, I think he just died of probably malaria. Like, wasn't died in battle or anything along those lines. But his father had a relationship with the current emperor and said, "Hey, listen, if anything happens to me, I want you to promise you're going to take care of my son." And so there was like a sacred vow. And so when his father died, he went to the emperor's court and was raised and educated there. And very unusual, educated in like statecraft, educated in politics. He would the two books that were kind of sacred to Ethiopians in leadership, the Kebra Nagast, which is just the glory of kings, and that's all about the lineage of the kingly line of Ethiopian kings, and the Fetha Nagast, which would be their code of laws. It's very medieval, very rustic, I would say. So mentored, tutored under the emperor's wise counsel. When the emperor passed away, he wasn't his path to leadership wasn't a clear one. There was two contenders for the throne, so to speak. He was one of them. And I should say this as well. His name actually, Haile Selassie, is actually his, I guess you say it's his Coptic name, his Christian name, and it means power of the Trinity. His real name was Tafari Makonnen. Tafari was his first name, Makonnen was his father's name, and just part of Ethiopian naming, that's how you would name your sons. So he became Rastafari, so now you know where Rastafarians came from. The term Ras actually just refers to a king or ruler. And so before he became fully embraced as Haile Selassie, he was Rastafari. So he was like the regent Tafari Makonnen of Ethiopia, the king without being the emperor, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, sorry, his name again, Haile Selassie, means literally
Power of the Trinity.
Power of the Trinity. Interesting.
Power of the Trinity. Yeah. So
what's fascinating about names, how these become such a shape of identity, right? Like,
absolutely.
And we don't think about it the same way in our culture, but obviously in ancient cultures, the naming of a child or somebody, or you see the changing of people's names and things. It's very significant, obviously.
Yeah. So when he did finally reach the throne, and there was some conflict getting there, it was not an easy path at all. He chose to be known as Haile Selassie. So he just, that was like, yeah, I want to adopt my Orthodox name, and that I'll be known as Haile Selassie. And a very devout, practicing Coptic Orthodox Christian, very, very devout. So the name for him was actually, I don't think it was just a PR stunt. I think there was something very meaningful in that for him.
Explain a little bit about the Coptic, this Coptic church or Coptic tradition. How does this play into the history of the nation and even with Haile Selassie?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I got into that. That's one of the side paths I get into when I get into these characters, to try and understand the context and the history. So Coptic church, based out of Egypt. So most people think of Christianity as being a very Euro-centered faith. In early Christianity, the two biggest centers actually were in Egypt and Iraq. And so North African and kind of what we call now the Middle East. And so the Coptic church would be the Egyptian manifestation of Christianity. Think Orthodox. And so if you ask like a Coptic, when did the church begin? They're going to say the day of Pentecost. For those who know, biblical history, they're going to say the same day that most Christians would say it began. But there was a real breach between a breaking off between that and the Roman Catholic Church. So Ethiopians, they followed the Coptic Orthodox Church. The I'd say arguably the oldest tradition that's out there. I'd say older than Roman Catholicism. Um, and they followed that. And actually, one of the cool things that he was able to do after much effort was actually not break off from the Coptic, the Egyptian oversight, but kind of establish we want our own Ethiopian church leadership. And it took some time, but yeah, there's now actually an Ethiopian Orthodox church, and that is interwoven. So although Ethiopia is very proudly multi-faith and multi-cultural, and there's actually not a long history of sectarian violence. It did happen, but there's not a lot of history of that. There's a large Muslim population there, but the people for the most part are very proudly. I said Coptic Orthodox. They're now, I mean, you'd say they're Ethiopian Orthodox in their faith.
Fascinating. Thank you, by the way. I mean, I'm always fascinating, and frankly, this is these are subject matters I know relatively little about, and so actually one of the reasons why I love having these chats with you, Craig. First of all, whether we're chatting in your house and having a drink, or my house, or we're doing this podcast, I'm always learning something from you because you study and you read, and it's so fascinating, and that's partly why I love just doing these episodes because I learn so much about history and people that I frankly. Haven't taken the time to read about and learn about as well. So you're like my Cole's notes.
Great, thank you.
Of history, which I like. So actually, we're going to call them Craig's notes.
Why not?
Craig's notes. We're going to call Craig's notes. Okay, so listen, when you go ahead and study this guy, and by the way, I appreciate the discipline around this. We talked about it last time, but so what are some of the character traits of Haile Selassie that really stand out to you, and why?
Yeah. So as far as some of the positive stuff, I do love his commitment to modernize the country. I love his. So I said when he rose to the throne and actually became emperor, like there was civil war there. I will say this, but one thing I noticed about him through all his political maneuverings, and he was a very crafty politician, very, very crafty. You didn't see the same kind of stuff that you see in other parts of the world. And what I mean by that is when you see like a real like power struggle and one person or one family takes power, all of a sudden the opponents are disappeared. And you can find mass graves 50 years later. And you didn't see that with him. So you didn't see that extreme personal political violence from him. I think he was very resilient. So as an African nation, all the power, all the money was through Europe at the time. So he understood something that most Ethiopians didn't. In order for us to move forward as a society, we need to engage the European and the Western power. So the U.S. was starting to come into their own at that point in time. But he wasn't kowtowed to them, and he wasn't afraid to kind of be taken advantage of. So Ethiopians, if I say the word xenophobic, it has a connotation that I don't think is really accurate in today's language. But the bottom line is they didn't really trust outsiders. And, if you look at the continent of Africa, can you blame them? Because whenever an outsider came, next thing you know, you were speaking their language, eating their food, and serving them. And so it was unusual for him to be so open-minded to outsiders. So his top advisors were like Swiss, German, British, French. He understood we have to engage while not kind of towing the party line, so to speak, and becoming a servant or a slave to them. I think that's really quite appealing.
Wow, that's a powerful trait, and again, that's an interesting conversation. If you're thinking about this and just thinking about his life and applying it to your life, if you're listening, I mean, that's a really fascinating idea. How do you engage with people in a way that actually connects you to better things and resources and living outside yourself, but at the same time retaining yourself a sense of identity? I mean, that's a delicate balance.
Yeah, for sure. And he was open-minded to some things, he was closed-minded to other things, and for whatever reason, he was able to navigate his own culture quite well, where people were willing to follow his lead, even though they were probably within their nature kind of uncomfortable. It's like, well, can't we just be Ethiopian, just be ourselves? And he recognized you couldn't, and for whatever reason, people were very comfortable. He had a strong presence of charisma around him. And that's impressive in his 5'1" frame, because he was not physically a commanding person, but everyone testifies that in his presence, they just like generals would just kind of melt. There was a composure and a conviction about him, and just an aura about him. And I think that's also kind of a compelling part of his story.
Yeah. It's an interesting word that you choose, charisma, because, I think the original Greek word for charisma would have a root of charis, and I believe charis in the Greek means grace. So that is a very interesting. When we think of charisma, there's a certain grace or power of grace that people, that who are charismatic can exude. Now, of course, a lot of people who are charismatic are not graceful or grace filled. But it's an interesting place where that word comes from. So when I hear you
Yeah.
talking about that, it's clearly that sense that he had a sense of understanding that charisma or that grace in relationship to how to deal with people and situations that became very powerful in his life.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
It's
Absolutely.
interesting. Now let's turn on the leadership side. So we've talked about a few of his personal characteristics. So from a leadership perspective, what are some of the traits that stand out to you as you studied him from a leadership perspective that were impressive to you?
Yeah. So I think I think his almost his self awareness, and
Okay.
that sounds like a strange thing to say, but he I think understood the image that he had to the people. And you have to remember, the emperor was not like a monarchy in another country. In Ethiopia, the emperor had real power. It was really an old, outdated, but they had real power. And I think he was really self aware and understood the importance of conveying the right, like almost like a kingly dignity, and going back to that gracious, charismatic presence to the people. He gave alms to the poor. Like that's like a
Huh.
medieval practice. Like he would drive around in his car and give out money to the poor. He took pride in being available to the common people. Um,
Interesting.
at one point in time, he took a vow, and it was one of these, God, if you do this, I will do that. Well, sure enough, this happened, and that happened as a result, and that was, whenever someone is in court, and the judicial system was pretty, it was pretty rough around the edges. But he would always promise to be and attend every single session of court, and be there and stand in the presence. So part of his identity was like he really embraced that idea. I'm the father of this country, and really backed that up. He certainly lived in comfort. There's some debate to this day whether he had a lot more money than he did, but he didn't seem to follow the path of a lot of other tyrants that have total control over their country's resources. Where they take on like a kleptocracy approach. Where I'm just going to loot the country, and he didn't seem to really do that. He seemed to live probably modest by today's standards. So curiosity, self-awareness, sense of conviction. I was something that caught me really strange to him, and I'm seeing this with a lot of leaders. Even in the midst of a demanding schedule, so he would wake up at like 3:30 in the morning, and he would spend like 3 hours like in prayer and meditation in a chapel, before he even got to work. And I'm seeing something there that's speaking to me a little bit about
Interesting.
leaders who kind of withdraw and retreat and take care of themselves. And even in the midst of some of his challenges, he was doing stuff like that. And that's spoken to me more, very surprisingly, to be honest with you, and in a personal way.
Interesting. And what resonates for me, and again, if you're listening in and you're a leader in your family or leader in your community or leader in your workplace or wherever, and we're all leaders at some level, but this is really important wisdom, I think, because I've had a conversation with a couple of senior leaders that I work with lately about self-care. And taking care of themselves emotionally, physically, because this is a marathon and a relay. I was telling somebody today, I was with one of the leaders I work with, I said, look, this is a marathon and a relay. It's not a sprint. And what I meant by that is it's a marathon because it's a long haul, but it's a relay because you're wanting to pass something along to others. This is a family business, actually, that we were talking this about. But, I think this is an important understanding. We're not machines. And we don't take care of ourselves. And again, whatever self-care looks like to you, for some of you, maybe like Haile Selassie, it looks like 3 hours of meditation or prayer, or call it what you want, a day. For others, it's going to the gym and eating right, or whatever it is. But I do really believe this is an important thing that we have to understand, that it's not selfish to care for yourself. That practicing good self-care of yourself emotionally, spiritually, whatever that means, psychologically, physically, is important, because particularly in highly demanding roles, that we're dumping a lot of energy every day into what we do, and if we're not prepared for that, then we are going to fail. We're going to fail ourselves, and frankly, we're going to fail our people. And I imagine that that's part of what the responsibility he felt. When I imagine in those times of 3 hours sitting in the darkness or meditating, you're contemplating the impact and influence you have over people's lives, and the absolute responsibility that comes with that. So, again, if you're listening in and you're hearing Craig describe this man and his practice, just ask yourself, what are your practices of self-care, and are they adequate to meet the demands that you have? Maybe, he needed 3 hours of meditation because he had 3 hours worth of meditative responsibility on his shoulders every day. That's a fascinating insight, and I really appreciate you sharing that with me and my listeners, Craig.
Yeah. Like I said, I think it's something that's hit me, which is why I've shared it today, because I've started thinking about my own self-care and my own routines daily and responsibilities. And we can make the mistake of assuming that's selfish and it's a waste of time because it doesn't have the appearance of being productive. But it is far from it. Far from it.
Well, it's kind of funny when you say that, because I was talking to somebody the other day, and we are talking about, he used the term time management. I said, well, time management, you can't manage time, you can only manage yourself. But I said, the weird thing about this whole time thing is that for some reason, whether, by design or by default, I don't really know. But, if you live till you're 90, you approximately sleep away 30 years of your life. That doesn't seem very efficient. That doesn't seem very productive. But apparently, we need rest. We need replenishment. We need to recharge. And again, when you get outside of the rhythm of that in your life, there's a price to pay. And obviously, Haile Selassie is reminding us of that today in his modeling of a certain understanding of how to be prepared to lead. You need to lead yourself first, and maybe you need to lead yourself into some quiet places. So it's a great reminder. So appreciate you pointing that out from a leadership perspective. So let's turn our attention to some of his accomplishments. So when you look at some of the things that he did, what stands out for you today as you look at him as his accomplishments?
The biggest one on paper. Now, I would say, he held a country together that, like I mentioned before, it was built up of a lot of little kingdoms. Like, this was not a cakewalk. They had their own rulers. They decided what they paid in taxes. It wasn't the emperor. They decided. And so it was like so I think that's really, really cool that he was able to manage and keep all the stakeholders and all the power brokers happy while moving the country forward. And he did it very tactically, strategically. He basically out-chessed them, if you want to put it that way. But on paper, I think the most impressive thing about him was the establishment of the African Union. So during his reign, over about a 20-year period, now he was in power for a lot longer, but there about 20-year period, there was about 38 African nations that either got their independence or who were born, all within about a 20-year period.
Wow.
And as you can imagine, that could, and it did, result in a lot of instability. There could have been a lot of bloodletting. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't pretty. But he stepped forward, and I think that's where that quote actually came from. To be honest with you, I think he was speaking to the founders of the African Union, and about the need just to work collaboratively. So think of it like the United Nations for a continent, or the European Union is maybe a more accurate way of putting it. And he was actually revered, even by people like Nelson Mandela, who met him, who worked with him. Nelson Mandela, who originally started off as a terrorist himself until he changed his approach, met with him and referred to him as the father of Africa. So he was revered as a peacemaker, a collaborator. Depending on the term and context, collaborators can be seen as a very negative thing, but someone who was able to find common ground with a lot of people. So you got to remember, a lot of these African nations, like European nations, some of them want to be democracies. Some of them want to be full-out communist. Some of them want to harken back to more fragmented, feudal, tribal approaches. And he was able to get everyone in the same room, diffused a few conflicts, on the way that could have spilled over. I hate to make it sound like it was all, all unicorns and rainbows. It wasn't. But the fact that all these individuals from different communities within Africa revered him, I think that's probably his biggest accomplishment. He got Ethiopia admitted to the League of Nations, and that was the precursor to the United Nations. So that was huge. He was the first the first Ethiopian regent to leave Ethiopia ever in their history, going back millennia. So there's a lot. He wrote his memoirs while he was in exile. When the Italians conquered them, he went into exile and he reflected in there. He built his support, wrote his memoirs, and then went back about 6 or 8 years later with British support as a returning king, as a conquering lion from the tribe of Judah, as is his title. And so there's a lot of cool things about him. I could talk about his courage, I could talk about his vision, a lot of stuff. I would be remiss if I didn't say that a little thing that made him unique and attractive to me is that, yes, he is literally revered as a manifestation of God on earth. So you don't see that. No one talks about Winston Churchill that way, or Martin Luther King that way, or Indira Gandhi that way. But yes, Haile Selassie is revered as a literal God on earth. And Rastafarians don't think he died. They think he's still very much alive.
Oh, really?
Yeah, how about that? Yeah.
Now I didn't realize that, so that's interesting. Wow, so. First of all, thanks for sharing that, and it's interesting as you talk about that. I think back at that quote now and understanding the context a little more. There's one line in that quote that I want to bring back to people: "Owing our ultimate allegiance not to nations, but to our fellow men within the human community." I mean, that's powerful. And again, if you're listening, that's a great challenge for you. Like, owing your ultimate allegiance not to your company, but to your fellow men and women and the human community you work with. Knowing your allegiance not to your nation, to your government, to your community, to your family, to your spiritual community, to your political party, but owing allegiance not to that system, but to our fellow men and women within the human community. That's where our allegiance ought to lie. I mean, as you talk about that now, and I think about what you've told me, that part of that quote really it becomes even more pregnant with a understanding and power. So often I think people, whether it's in business or communities, we put our allegiance maybe to the wrong thing, the system. And when we put our allegiance to the system, then we end up often out on the other side of the human part of that.
Yeah.
So that's a great reminder. Are you honoring the system more than you're honoring your fellow humans in this journey of life? Maybe you need to reconsider that. Maybe you need to understand what that means. Maybe you need to read more about Haile Selassie and learn from his life. Craig, let me ask you a question as we just dive into a couple of things as we finish up. I got a question for you. So I think you have recently written a series of articles, I believe, or posts around Haile Selassie's life. On your website. Is that right?
Yeah, it's still in progress. Probably by the time this goes to air, it'll probably be done. As always, I have to say, part of my process, I intend to write 3 articles, and I end up writing like 5 or 6. So, but yeah, absolutely. I've done a fair bit of writing and research on him, and I'm getting that published right now. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So listen, again, after you listen to this podcast, if you're interested in learning more about Haile Selassie, go to historyunfurled.com. And check out the other things that Craig has written and mused about this particular gentleman. Now, Craig, with all these people, if we're not careful, in fact, I think you just said that he was considered godlike, and for some people, is still considered godlike. The reality is there's always this human underbelly underneath even these men and women that appear so godlike, which is the dichotomy of the human condition. So when you look at him in a very human way, well, let's pretend for a second he's not a god, and you look at his failures, his flaws. I will call them fuck ups because it's the Uncommodified podcast. We'll call them that.
Yeah.
What are some of the most significant failures and flaws and fuck ups that you would say, hey, look, we have to be honest and we have to acknowledge that there are a few failures along the way, even for this man who's considered a bit of a god or demigod to many people?
Yeah, and I think just to clarify as well, he knew he wasn't a god. he actually rejected it openly many times. No Ethiopians, by the way, think he's a god. They think if you believe he's a god, you got something wrong upstairs. So he rejected that outright over and over and over again. But you don't actually have to look too far to find some of his flaws. And the one that's really it's just glaring for me is he was committed to modernizing his country. Education, building roads, getting cars in there, the financial system, getting a central bank, like all building hospitals, all really, really great things, really open to changing everything in his country other than himself. And he had a constitution drafted, which, by the way, was actually a really cool thing. At least it had the appearance of that, because no one was putting pressure under him to do that. He just did it on his own. But part of the Constitution was the emperor will always remain the supreme ruler, and the only person who can ever be an emperor has to be in the same bloodline as himself. So he was willing to change all these systems and make other people change, but he was not willing to change his own role, and he paid the price for that. And just he survived several coup attempts. And ironically, what he would do is he would send students overseas. Like he'd send them to Europe for educations. He would personally fund them. He actually met with every single student he sent overseas to get an education, gave them money for it, and would give them some inspiring words like, come back and make Ethiopia a better place. So he thought, yeah, they're going to go, they're going to get educated, they're going to come back as engineers and business people, and there was no IT at the time, but communication specialists and military specialists, and they did. But what he didn't predict was they were going to go see what countries that didn't have an emperor, how they operated, with the freedom of the press, freedom to criticize your leaders, what a full democracy looks like. And so ironically, a lot of those coups, actually all of them, were led by students that he funded to go and broaden their horizons. And they came back and said, oh, we'll broaden our horizons. All right, we want a new system of government.
Interesting. Fascinating.
Yeah, so I think that's very, very ironic. But yeah, like I said, willing to change everything else, but was not willing to change his role. When it came time to forming a government with a parliament, similar to a parliament we would recognize here in our country, he personally handpicked every single member of that parliament, which really counters the notion of democracy and representing the people. So control, and it led to his downfall for sure.
Interesting. So, what an interesting thing. On one level, all the character traits you talked about, leadership traits, the positive things, and then you got this weird thing going on that on one level he's all about the poor, and he's going to court, and then on the other level he drafts a constitution which entrenches himself and his lineage as the only rulers. It's it's a fascinating study in the human condition, and again, we can sit in this podcast or anything else, or you can watch a documentary about him or read Craig's stuff on his website, and we can sit in judgment on these people of history, but they're no different than we are. Craig, and you and I have talked about this. They're full of butterflies and bullshit, just like we are. Yeah. And there's things that we're amazing at and we're proud of, and then underneath that we got our own subset of challenges and difficulties. And the great thing is you and I don't lead nations, so that they're not going to write biographies about us that are going to live on forever, and people can muse about our misgivings and our challenges. But it's fascinating to me that on one level a person can be so enlightened or seemingly enlightened, and then on another level it's like they live in darkness. And as I say that, it's almost like the earth itself. When half the earth's in sunlight, half the earth's in darkness. I guess we're sort of like that. Half of our psyche is enlightened, and half of our psyche might be in darkness. Half of our behavior is in the light, and half of our behavior is in the darkness. I don't know. Maybe it shouldn't be that way, but even on the earth itself, we have this strange thing that we can only expose a portion of this earth to the sun at the same time. Maybe we're like that, Craig. Maybe only a portion of ourselves gets exposed to the light, and then the rest of us lives in some weird dark coldness. I don't know what's going on, brother.
Yeah, but those are the stories we like, right? And it just humanizes someone who's pretty inspiring, but really had those flaws. And, it's dripping with irony. And, he even had good people in his life. He still maintained his, I'm the emperor. But he had good people in his life and said, listen, just give up a little bit of power. You still live in comfort. Like, we're not looking to banish you. They wanted a constitutional monarchy. And he just, that stubbornness, and I think he even snarkily replied, like, well, did Jesus resign? Like he was known to pull out religious, because he was so well read and so devout. So yeah, you're right. It's just that conundrum between the two, the light and the dark side, and we can have
Yeah.
both, and we
Well,
do.
we are, and we are.
Yeah.
We're amalgam of all these things, and so is Haile Selassie and all the other leaders we talk about. And again, let's not take a position of judgment if you're listening. I mean, if you're listening to this, you're an amalgam of light and darkness as well. And I think if you ever believe you're not, then you have bigger problems that you're going to need to deal with. So listen, let's bring this in for a landing. So let me ask you. So when you look personally, and what I love about you is you interact with these leaders and from a historical perspective, but you also look at what does it mean to you today. So when you look at his life and his legacy, how does it challenge you to live and to lead? And how should it challenge us?
In light of the conversation we just had about his flaws, I truly believe he wanted to serve. I really believe he wanted to make Ethiopians' lives better. And I really, truly believe that. Again, there's some debate, even in Ethiopia right now, there's some debate about whether he's more hero or villain. So I've read current articles from Ethiopian intellectuals. They don't know. But I think what they agree on, that sounds kind of weak and soft to say his heart was in the right place. I think he authentically wanted to modernize the country. He wanted to make sure they maintained their dignity. They're the only African nation that's never been colonized, and he took a lot of pride in that. And they're the only. They're actually one of 3 countries in the world that's never been colonized by European power. So I think he gave people a sense of pride of being an Ethiopian. And you got to remember, poor, like these are poor farmers. It's a rural environment, but I think he legitimately cared and wanted to lift people up. I think if you read his memoirs, like I've read, you see that he just seems to want to really empower and encourage people. And I'm willing to kind of give him a pass in a way and say, yeah, you were stubborn. Yeah, you were stubborn, and I wish you didn't do what you did. He paid for it with his life. But I'm willing to give him a pass because I think he legitimately believed it was the best way to give the Ethiopian people dignity. And when they did finally find his bones, because his body was buried kind of unceremoniously, the streets were closed down. They gave him a state funeral. He was buried with high honors, and his body was interred with the rest of the Ethiopian kings. And I think that just speaks to the power of his convictions, of his servant-like nature to the people around him. Got it wrong, may have made some mistakes, but I really do think his intentions were for the people.
Interesting. So let me ask you, so does that challenge you to serve in a different way in your life? Or what does it ultimately challenge you to do when you examine his life and then allow it to examine yours?
Yeah.
What does it ultimately challenge you to do?
So, Tim, I'm in a great job right now, and you know this. I mean, I've talked about it. I'm and the journey has landed me in a great place where what I do for a living, is I write material. I share that material. I write curriculum for organizations around soft skills, communication skills, leadership stuff. That's what I do, and I teach people and coach people a little bit. And how it's actually affected me is when I'm writing this material and when I'm drafting and the content, it's actually given me a reason to pause a little bit and ask myself some really provocative questions like, Craig, are you writing this because you love to tell the story and you think it's going to make you feel good and it's going to make you look funny and make you look entertaining? Or are you actually communicating this because this is what your audience needs to hear? And it's For me, it's trying to migrate away from a focus on style and more substance, and really trying to go through life saying, life is short. We got one shot at this, and maybe there's some things I can do, and with a laser focus as an expression of servanthood of the people who I work with.
So listen, great challenge that obviously Haile Selassie has given you and what you do, Craig. If you're listening to this podcast right now, let that be a challenge to you. What are you serving for the right reasons? Are you doing things for the benefit of the people? Are you becoming bigger than you've been? According to that first quote we talked about, are you becoming a bigger person along the journey? Are you more courageous, as that quote said? Are you greater in spirit? Are you larger in outlook? Are you looking bigger and beyond just the world you live in? And I think, as Craig, as you talk, I think that reading and studying Haile Selassie's life is causing you to think about that. And then again, that quote goes on to say, we must become members of a new race. And it's interesting when you think about that. Again, we are so sectarian in our thinking. Members of a new race, a bigger race, a more inclusive race. What does that look like for you? Just think through this quote and look it up if you need to, and I'll include it in the show notes. Maybe meditate if you need to on this quote and think about it. We must become bigger than we've been, more courageous, greater in spirit, larger in outlook. We must become members of a new race. What does that mean to you? Overcoming petty prejudice. What's the petty prejudice in your life that's controlling you? What are you don't want to admit it, but you're prejudiced against certain things that are petty, that are controlling you and causing you to do different things. And ultimately, then the end of that quote, owing our ultimate allegiance, not to nations, not to systems, not to businesses, not to ideology, not to just religion, not to belief systems, but to, and in his words, not to nations, but rather to our fellow men and women within the human community. Let that quote speak to you and challenge you. Let it provoke you to live a better life on purpose, uncommodify yourself, live differently, stand up for all the right reasons. That's what this podcast is all about at the end of the day. Craig, as always, I'm inspired when I talk to you. I just become such a fascinating journey as we go on these journeys together. And again, if you're looking up Craig, you can find him at historyunfurled.com. Please look up what he's doing. He's doing some great work there. And I'm going to continue to journey with Craig over the next period of time and season of my own podcast to have him back on here and do some more. I think at some point, Craig, I think that you have a podcast in your future as well, I believe.
In the future, at some point in time, it's something I'm eager to get into. For sure.
Awesome. So that'll be exciting, and then you guys can look that up as well. And so do me a favor, as you think about all this and distill this into your life, email me at tim@theuncommodified.com or check me out on social media, find us on social media, and let Craig and I know how you're uncorking this, like a bottle of whiskey that we uncork here, how you're uncorking this into your life and how you're pouring out the lessons and the provocation of Haile Selassie into your world so that you can become the person that you need to become for your world, for your influence. Again, as we finish up, we must become bigger than we've been, more courageous, greater in spirit, larger in outlook. We must become members of a new race, overcoming petty prejudice, owing our ultimate allegiance not to nations or systems, but to our fellow men and women within the community. Thank you for listening, and have an excellent day.